Just going to begin with the case that got me really interested in this whole topic, and that was my dad's experience with a large left renal cell cancer in 1987. It was my first experience of a symptom as metaphor, and my dad would gesture to his abdomen and use a phrase from transactional analysis. If you remember, "I'm okay, you're okay," and his phrase was, "I'm building up a crud ball of frustration," and he would gesture to his lower left abdomen, which is where the tumor actually developed, and it was quite a large tumor, about the size of a large orange or a small grapefruit. And he, in the course of the preceding decade, he'd been passed over for vice president at his place of business in a steel mill, and he kept a bullshit file on his computer of all his frustrations, and he seemed to be pissed off in general about his job. But he was a very positive thinker, which would fit with the water element constitution. But he became very fearful when it seemed like he couldn't positively think his way out of this situation or out of his cancer. So that was my first introduction to the idea of metaphor, and I actually was reading Bernie Siegel's book at the time. And if some of you remember, Love, Medicine, and Miracles came out that same year, and the subtitle is Lessons Learned About Self-Healing from a Surgeon's Experience with Exceptional Patients by Bernie Siegel, the surgeon who was one of the first big proponents of self-healing in cancer situations. Also came across Louise Hay's book, Heal Your Body. The little blue book cost like $10. The subtitle is The Mental Causes for Physical Illness and the Metaphysical Way to Overcome Them. And now she had a whole laundry list of symptoms in an encyclopedic fashion that you could look up and figure out what the metaphor was for your symptom. So when I stumbled across that, I started using it. I looked up my dad first. And you can see here the metaphors for renal cancer. Looked up kidney problems. It says criticism, disappointment, failure. Clearly issues that were up for him in his job situation. And then cancer itself was deep hurt, long-standing resentment, deep secret or grief eating away at self, carrying hatreds. These are relatively non-specific descriptions, and I've always been somewhat skeptical of Louise Hay in that some of the connections she makes seem to be gross generalizations and oversimplifications, but in this case it seemed to be right on the money. And as I've used the book over the years, I usually find some nugget of truth in whatever intuitive connection she made between symptoms and metaphors. Then I started using it for myself. So here is a list of my other symptoms and metaphors that I explored using the book. And I have a pretty much wood and fire constitution, so I didn't label each one of these symptoms, but I had severe lower leg cramps and way beyond the usual Charlie horse, and I found myself practically crawling to the bookshelf to get the book. And I looked it up in the book, and it said fear moving forward. And as it turned out, I was closing on my first house the very next day. And when I realized the connection between my symptom and my fear, it went away. And I also said the affirmation that she recommended again, and thought, well, that was an interesting, maybe coincidence at that time, but it seemed to fit. So then a couple months later, while working on a radiology paper, I had a severe case of hemorrhoids for like one of the first times in my life. And I said, well, I'm going to look that up in the book. And I looked it up, and it says fear of deadlines. And sure enough, I had a publication deadline the next week that I was pushing really hard and to complete. And as soon as I turned the paper in, the hemorrhoids went away, never to return. So the book was starting to get my attention now after those two personal experiences. Then years later, when I had started exploring EFT and a lot of emotional processing, I had this really unusual experience with a cold. And it was one of those nights when I went out to the theater with Dagmar, and it seemed to be like sort of a drafty theater, a little chilly, and I felt like I got a wind invasion as I was coming home. And so we did all the usual things for a wind invasion, like I drank hot ginger tea, took a hot bath, sweated it out, did some echinacea, and really nipped it in the bud. So the next morning I got up, I felt fine. However, later the next night, I started getting this really annoying postnasal drip. And it just kept going and going, and tried to go to sleep, and was just having an annoying cough the whole time, and really wasn't getting anywhere getting to sleep. So I looked it up in the book, and it said inner crying. And I said, no, that's not me. I put the book back, and I did some EFT and was tapping on the symptoms themselves, like the annoying cough, postnasal drip, and was getting no results. So I suffered for that whole night. Got up the next morning, still didn't really have a cold, and didn't have any postnasal drip during the day, but then that night, the same thing happened again. It got more annoying, kept coughing that whole night, and I was getting pretty exhausted. And then the next day, I dragged through the day, and hopefully it was going to be gone that night, but sure enough, it wasn't. So I'm getting pretty desperate by this time, and I'm coughing all night long. And I've moved downstairs to camp out in the basement because I'm not getting anywhere, getting to sleep. And about 2 in the morning, I get totally desperate and finally start to surrender and start tapping on. I have no idea why I have this blankety blank postnasal drip. And I coughed so hard I felt like I almost broke a rib. And then in the middle of that tapping sequence, as I was really letting go, I flashed back to the movie that we had watched, which was Shall We Dance with Richard Gere and Jennifer Lopez. And Richard Gere plays a guy, I'm not going to make a lot of spoilers for the movie, but he has a midlife crisis, goes to take ballroom dance lessons. Jennifer Lopez is his teacher, and he hides the fact that he's taking the lessons from his wife and daughter. But his daughter can kind of see right through his whole facade. And I flash back to the recognition that, oh, his daughter reminds me of my 2 teenage daughters. And I had just gotten a divorce a few years before and wasn't seeing as much of them as I would have liked to have been seeing. And I realized I missed my kids. And I started to cry. I started to tap on really missing my daughters. And cried for a good half hour and tapped this called emphatic EFT, if you tap and have deep emotional release at the same time. I got up and sent my daughters an email in the middle of the night. Postnasal drip went away completely. I slept like a baby the rest of the night. Didn't have any other problem after that. So the inner crying metaphor in the book had been right on the money. And it took me 3 days to finally get to the point where I was ready to deal with it. Sometimes denial is the biggest problem we have in working with these kinds of metaphors. Then, as I was doing the editing of my book, I got 2 small basal cell cancers and had surgery for them. I wasn't really getting anywhere with exploring the metaphors for them, so I went to the Mohs surgery. Then, after the surgery, I developed a 3rd lesion on my face. It didn't look like a basal cell, it looked more like a melanoma, and it came up really quickly. I did a lot of tapping on that, did a lot of praying about it, and also looked it up in the book, and it said what we show the world was a metaphor for the face. And I realized, okay, I was getting ready to release this book, which is a memoir and very self-revealing, and I had the recognition that what I really needed to do was go back and edit out any anger and low vibrations that I put in the book so that I didn't send out into the world. I went through challenging editing process. Edited out everything I thought I didn't want to show. And it was like bibliotherapy for me to have written it, but then I took it back out. And I put iodine on the skin lesion, which is something I've learned to do over the years. Sometimes works very well for precancerous lesions. They'll flake off after a couple of days of iodine, just tincture of iodine over the counter. And I've been putting it on for a few days, and not much had been happening. When I finally got down to the deep release of the anger out of the book, it started to flake off. And I had already scheduled a repeat visit with the Mohs surgeon to have another biopsy. And it flaked off a little bit the day before, and then the morning when I got up to go to the biopsy, the whole thing fell off, and I had nothing but normal skin underneath it, so I canceled the biopsy. So that metaphor worked really well for me in that case in guiding me to edit the book. Finally, I've had chronic shoulder pain for 20 plus years of various different types of bursitis and tendonitis, but I got a frozen shoulder, which I write about in chapter 16. And the metaphor for shoulder pain is carrying the burdens of life. But when you're dealing with a frozen shoulder, in my experience for myself and also with clients, they're often frozen with anger as the metaphor. And the healing process is about thawing the frozen shoulder. So I'm going to go through frozen shoulders in a little more detail because I think it's one of the most important somatic metaphors there is. And it's actually a very, very common condition as well. So you may encounter it in your practice.
For more information on this or other ProD live, distance, or online courses, please visit www.prodseminars.com.